Welcome to Chapter 6 Apology by Plato. This is from the exam point of view that I'm making these videos. I'll be reading through the text of this video. Let's start with the summary of Socrates' proposal for his sentence. Socrates expresses no grief over his condemnation, as he expected it, and is surprised the vote was so close. He notes that without Anytus and Lycon, Meletus would have failed to secure enough votes and would have been fined. Since Meletus proposes death, Socrates sarcastically asks what his own just punishment should be. He argues that he deserves a reward, not punishment, as he has spent his life urging people to seek virtue over material wealth. He suggests being maintained at the Prytaneum, an honor given to Olympic champions, because he provides a greater service to Athens than they do. Socrates dismisses other possible penalties. Prison would make him a slave to magistrates. A fine is impractical since he has no wealth. Exile is futile because wherever he goes, he will continue his questioning and he will be driven out. When asked why he cannot simply remain silent, Socrates insists that his mission is divinely ordained and that the unexamined life is not worth living. Eventually, he proposes a fine of 30 minae, which his friends offer to pay. Socrates comments on his sentence. After being sentenced to death, Socrates tells Athens that their reputation will suffer as people will remember them for killing a wise man. He asserts that he lost not due to lack of words, but because he refused to beg or appeal emotionally. He believes avoiding injustice is harder than avoiding death, and while his accusers think they have won, they will suffer greater judgment in the future. Socrates then shares a prophecy. His death will bring more critics to challenge the Athenians, leading to more trouble for them. He insists that death is not an evil, but either a peaceful sleep or a journey to an afterlife where he can continue his philosophical inquiries with great figures like Homer and Odysseus. He concludes by reassuring his supporters that no evil can happen to a good man, whether in life or death. He does not resent his accusers, but asks that if his sons ever prioritize wealth over virtue, Athenians should rebuke them just as he rebuked others. Finally, he acknowledges that the time has come for him to die. While the jury will continue to live, yet only the gods know which faith is better. Character sketch and critical evaluation of important characters. Let's go to Socrates first. Socrates, the central figure in the text, is a philosopher known for his unwavering commitment to truth, virtue, and intellectual inquiry. He values wisdom over material wealth and social status and dedicates his life to teaching and questioning. His method of argumentation, the Socratic method, is based on questioning assumptions and exposing ignorance. Socrates is deeply principled and refuses to engage in emotional appeals or flattery to save himself. He believes that his mission is divinely ordained and he embraces his faith with courage and dignity. Critical evaluation. Socrates emerges as a fearless and uncompromising thinker who prioritizes moral integrity over self preservation. His insistence on provoking thought and questioning authority makes him both revered and resented. While his defiance is admirable, One could argue that his rigid stance contributed to his downfall. A more pragmatic approach might have saved his life, but he refuses to betray his principles. His rejection of exile or silence underscores his belief that life without philosophy is meaningless. However, some may view this as arrogance or stubbornness rather than pure devotion to wisdom. Meletus. Meletus is one of Socrates' chief accusers, leading the charge against him on the grounds of impiety and corrupting the youth. He is portrayed as a young, inexperienced, and somewhat opportunistic figure who lacks strong reasoning skills. Socrates easily exposes the weaknesses in his arguments during the trial. Meletus appears as a tool used by more powerful figures like Anytus and Lycon to prosecute Socrates. He lacks the depth of understanding needed to counter Socrates' philosophical rigor and is unable to provide a coherent or compelling justification for the charges. His role in the trial reflects how demagogues and ambitious individuals can exploit legal systems to silence dissent. However, while he is depicted as weak and misguided, he still plays a pivotal role in Socrates' conviction. Anytus. Anytus is a prominent politician and one of Socrates' key accusers. Unlike Meletus, he has political influence and represents the established order. He likely views Socrates' teaching as a threat to Athenian traditions and the authority of the ruling class. Critical evaluation. Anytus symbolizes the clash between new ideas and conservative values. He likely fears that Socrates' questioning of authority undermines the existing social and political structure. His hostility towards Socrates is not merely personal but ideological. He sees Socrates as dangerous to Athenian democracy. However, his approach is authoritarian as he resorts to eliminating his intellectual adversaries rather than engaging in open debate. This reflects how power often surpasses dissenting voices rather than addressing their concerns rationally. Lycon. Character sketch. Lycon is the third accuser, though he plays a less prominent role than Meletus and Anytus. He is likely aligned with the professional rhetoricians and orators who feel threatened by Socrates' criticism of their deceptive practices. Critical evaluation. Lycon represents the interests of Athenian elites who rely on persuasion rather than truth. His involvement in the trial indicates how Socrates' relentless pursuit of truth made him enemies among various influential groups. Like Anytus, he prefers eliminating Socrates rather than engaging with his ideas. His role highlights how self interest often overrides justice in political and legal proceedings. Plato, Crito, Critobulus, and Apollodorus, Socrates' supporters. These men are devoted followers and friends of Socrates. Plato, in particular, is one of Socrates' most famous students and later becomes the primary preserver of his teachings. Crito, Critobulus, and Apollodorus offer financial and moral support, suggesting an alternative penalty for Socrates, a fine to save him from execution. Critical evaluation. These supporters embody the next generation of thinkers influenced by Socratic philosophy. They recognize the value of Socrates' teachings and his intellectual legacy. Their willingness to pay a fine for Socrates' freedom contrasts with the hostility of his accusers, highlighting the divide between those who value wisdom and those who seek to suppress it. However, their efforts are ultimately in vain, as Socrates refuses to compromise his principles. Let's look at the chapter Critical Evaluation. The chapter, likely drawn from Plato's Apology, presents Socrates' defense speech during his trial in Athens, where he is accused of impiety and corrupting the youth. The chapter serves as a profound philosophical discourse on justice, wisdom, and moral integrity, while also exposing the flaws in Athenian democracy and legal proceedings. One of the most compelling aspects of the chapter is Socrates' unwavering commitment to truth and wisdom. His famous assertion, I know that I know nothing, challenges the false confidence of those who claim knowledge without true understanding. Socrates' critics, the politician, poets, and craftsmen, revealing that their supposed wisdom is superficial. This aspect of the chapter highlights intellectual humility and the importance of questioning assumptions. Socrates' approach remains influential today in academic and philosophical discussions. The Socratic method and the dialectic, dialectical reasoning. Socrates' use of the Socratic method Alanchus, questioning his accusers and forcing them to confront their contradictions, demonstrates his mastery of logical argumentation. He exposes Meletus's inconsistencies, showing that Meletus has no real understanding of his own accusations. Critical insight. This method of reasoning has been foundational in modern education, law, and philosophy. However, it also reveals the limitations of logic in persuading those driven by emotion or personal interests. Moral and ethical integrity. Socrates refuses to compromise his values even when his life is at stake. He could have pleaded for mercy or accepted exile, but he remains steadfast in his principles. He argues that the unexamined life is not worth living, reinforcing his belief that truth and self-inquiry are more important than survival. While his integrity is admirable, some critics argue that his rigidity and refusal to engage in self-preservation were impractical. He could have continued his philosophical work in exile, but instead he chose his martyrdom. Martyrdom, weaknesses and criticism. While Socrates claims to be humble, his tone can sometimes appear arrogant and condescending. His mockery of Meletus and his claim that he alone fulfills a divine philosophical mission make him seem elitist rather than genuinely modest. A more strategic or persuasive defense might have saved his life. Instead of alienating the jury, he could have sought common ground. His failure to do so suggests that his downfall was partly self inflicted. Athenian democracy and its limitations. The trial of Socrates exposes serious flaws in Athenian democracy. Instead of fostering intellectual debate and freedom of thought, the system punishes dissent. The fact that a majority vote decides his fate highlights the dangers of mob rule and emotional decision making in democratic societies. The chapter serves as a critique of direct democracy, where public opinion can be manipulated to surpass intellectual voices. This remains relevant in modern politics, where populism often overrides rational discourse. The role of Socrates as a gadfly. Socrates likens himself to a gadfly, a small insect that irritates a lazy horse, in this case Athens. While this metaphor effectively conveys his role in awakening the state, it also suggests that he intentionally provoked hostility. His mission to challenge authority was noble but inevitably led to conflict. This raises question about whether reform should be gradual or confrontational. Socrates' aggressive questioning style may have been necessary, but it also hastened his demise. What is its relevance to modern society? The themes of the chapter remain deeply relevant today: freedom of speech versus political power. Just as Socrates was persecuted for challenging authority, modern thinkers, journalists, and activists face suppression when they question powerful institutions. The importance of critical thinking. The Socratic method emphasizes the need for logical reasoning and self inquiry, which are crucial in an era of misinformation and ideological bias. Democratic flaws and populism. Socrates Socrates' trial shows how democracy can be flawed when it surpasses dissenting voices instead of engaging with them. The dangers of majority rule without critical thinking remain a concern in modern political systems. Final evaluation and conclusion. The chapter is a masterpiece of philosophical reasoning and ethical debate. Socrates' courage, wisdom, and commitment to truth make him a timeless figure, but his unwillingness to compromise also contributes to his downfall. The trial highlights the dangers of blind authority, the flaws of democracy, and the struggle between power and wisdom. However, his arrogance and unwillingness to adapt are valid criticisms. A more pragmatic approach could have allowed him to continue his teachings. Nonetheless, his martyrdom ensures that his ideas live on, influencing generations of thinkers from Plato to modern philosophers. Overall, the chapter serves as both an intellectual trump and a cautionary tale about the cost of unwavering idealism in a society that fears change. Let's complete the who said to whom context. I am wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not. Whereas, when I do not know, neither do I think I know. Said by Socrates to the jury, Athenians. Socrates explains his wisdom as revealed by the oracle at Delphi, stating that true wisdom is knowing one's ignorance. Second quote: the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates to the jury. All of this mostly is said by Socrates to the jury. Socrates defends his pursuit of truth and philosophy, arguing that questioning and self examination are essential for a meaningful life. You, Meletus, have sufficiently shown that you never had a thought about the young. Socrates to Meletus. Socrates cross examines Meletus, exposing contradictions in his accusation that Socrates corrupts the youth. Does a man exist who would rather be harmed than benefited by those who live with him? Socrates to Meletus. Socrates argues that it would be illogical for him to corrupt the youth deliberately, since harming them would ultimately harm himself. I do not fear death, but I do fear wrongdoing. Socrates to the jury. Socrates prioritizes moral integrity over his own survival, showing his commitment to truth and justice. Sixth, if you kill me, you will not easily find another like me. Socrates to the jury. Socrates warns Athens that silencing him will not rid them of critical thinkers, but will instead harm their intellectual progress. Next, I am that gadfly which the god has attached to the state. Socrates to the jury. Socrates compares himself to a gadfly, constantly questioning and provoking Athens to prevent intellectual stagnation. Next, no one knowingly does wrong. Socrates to the jury. Socrates argues that wrongdoing is a result of ignorance rather than intentional evil. reinforcing his philosophical stance on morality. Let us reflect that there is great reason to hope that death is a good. Socrates to the jury. After being sentenced to death, Socrates presents the idea that death may be a transition to a better existence or a peaceful sleep. Next, a good man cannot be harmed either in life or in death. Socrates to the jury. Socrates asserts that a virtuous person remains morally untouchable regardless of external circumstances. Next, I am not an orator, but I speak the truth. Socrates to the jury. Socrates contrasts himself with the professional rhetoricians of Athens, emphasizing his commitment to honesty over persuasion. I have never been anyone's teacher. Socrates to the jury. Socrates refutes the charge that he deliberately corrupted the youth, stating that he never formally instructed anyone. Next, it is not difficult to avoid death, gentlemen. It is much more difficult to avoid wickedness. Socrates to the jury. Socrates argues that evading death is easy, but evading moral corruption requires true effort and integrity. Next, I am far from making a defense for my own sake, as you may think, but for yours. Socrates to the jury. Socrates suggests that his defense is not self serving, but aimed at protecting Athens from injustice and ignorance. Next, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Socrates, Euthyphro, in a dialogue outside the trial. Socrates challenges conventional religious beliefs, questioning the nature of pity and divine approval. I do not grieve as much for myself as for you. Socrates to the jury. Socrates expresses sorrow not for his own fate, but for Athens, which he believes is harming itself by condemning a seeker of truth. What I do is to go about persuading you all to care not for your bodies or wealth, but for the best possible state of your souls. Socrates to the jury. Socrates describes his philosophical mission of prioritizing virtue and wisdom over material concerns. Next, I owe a rooster to Asclepius. Ignore my spelling error. Socrates to Crito before his execution. Socrates' final words possibly implying that death is a cure, much like an offering to the god of healing. Anytus and Meletus can harm me in no way. They cannot stop the truth. Socrates to the jury. Socrates remains defiant, stating that while his body can be condemned, his ideas and principles will live on. Next, I would rather die having spoken after my manner than speak in your manner and live. Socrates to the jury. Socrates refuses to conform or change his message simply to avoid punishment, reaffirming his commitment to truth. With this, I complete this chapter. Thank you very much for listening. Take care and best of luck.